Honorable Speaker. Upon reading this particular constitutional amendment bill, also known as the BBI bill, I have become extremely disturbed. It is very clear and apparent that a vast majority of the proposals do not need a constitutional amendment to be effected. Bottom line, it's mostly about creating political positions. This bill will go down in history as one of the biggest frauds in Kenya's legislative making process. And as I oppose this bill, I would like to point out a few clauses, just a few examples of the reasons why it is in fact a fraud and is not necessary for us to have constitutional amendment. For example, clause 2, which proposes to make regional integration and cohesion as part of a way of Kenya achieving its economic goals. Actually, it is very absurd for Kenya to put that requirement in its own constitution, yet our neighbors have not done the same. Basically, it's akin to making a constitutional change in order to achieve regional integration. It is like requiring a law, passing a law that I must make a friend of my neighbor. That does not require constitutional change. Usually, that can be done through treaties and other bilateral agreements, but not through constitutional change. Another example is clause 3. Clause 3 says that we need to have a new economic model called shared prosperity. But when a deeper reading of this bill shows it's nothing but an empty buzzword. Shared prosperity is a good thing. Pay inequality, income inequality, wealth inequality cannot be cured by a constitutional statement. It can only be achieved through competent budget planning and execution. It has to be a deliberate effort through careful and prudent economic stewardship of a country, not a constitutional change statement. Clause 4, which deals with citizens' responsibilities. Again, this probably is one of the most absurd clauses that we have in this bill. It goes on to say, to require that we must deliberately promote, protect the well-being of family, including the respect for parents and elders. That is not something that is achieved by having it inside a constitution. That can only be achieved either through upbringing or encouragement through school curriculum and education. But it cannot be a declaration or achieved through a declaration in our constitution. In fact, this is a very good example of what is bad law. In fact, had it even been put in any other legislation, it would still be considered the most absurd law that cannot be implemented. If I put my attention to clause 5, clause 5 proposes to amend Article 31 of our Constitution to incorporate the right to protection of personal data. Again, this is another superfluous, unnecessary amendment to the Constitution. Already the current Constitution states that every person has a right to privacy, which includes the right for their property, information, and so on not to be infringed upon. So therefore, it was highly unnecessary to again create a new constitutional amendment that purportedly provides protection of personal data, which is something that already exists in our current constitution. Again, this tells you that the proponents of the BBI bill were simply throwing in amendments here and there so as to justify the creation of an expanded executive and also an expanded parliament. I now look at clause 6, Honorable Speaker. Kenyans have been misled in that clause 6 that corruption will be cured by this amendment. But I would like Kenyans to know very well, and I plead with this House to look at it. That clause 6, which purportedly is supposed to fight corruption, does not actually fight corruption. All it says is that Parliament shall enact legislation for expeditious disposal of corruption cases. It does not give us any cure for corruption whatsoever. And in any case, corruption doesn't exist in Kenya because of lack of laws. In fact, we have no less than 11 pieces of legislation that deal with corruption. And therefore, putting another provision in the Constitution indicating that Parliament shall enact a law, that doesn't guarantee us any fight against corruption. In fact, we know that many times the Constitution has said that Parliament shall enact a law, and we know that this Parliament is guilty of declining to enact laws. Clause 7, which is legislation on elections. Again, this has been touted by proponents of BBI as being able to cure post-election violence or post-election disagreements. But it does not. A close reading of it simply says that Parliament shall enact legislation to impose sanctions on parties that do not implement the 2/3 gender rule. Again, this is another counterproductive and necessary amendment that can be done through amendments to the Political Parties Act. You do not need to have a constitutional change in order to achieve this. Again, proponents of BBI have gone on to say that clause 8, which deals with the electoral disputes, is going to solve any disagreements after elections. And all it is doing, actually, the truth be told, it does not cure post-election violence. It simply broadens the mode of service when you want to file an election petition. Historically, this comes from the situation where in 1992 and 1997, when you required personal service, it was difficult to serve your opponent. So it has not cured any post-election violence whatsoever. In fact, it is introducing a very dangerous system of serving persons electronically. This can be infringed upon, the security of that method. It can also be abused and can even be used to perpetrate fraud. The current service that we have, which is through either direct or through newspapers, adverts, is sufficient enough. There is no mischief whatsoever that this superfluous constitutional amendment could possibly do to change some of the challenges that we have with the disagreements after the electoral process. And I think in the interest of time and to give other people an opportunity, I'll point out one more also. Clause number 10, which deals with delimitation of electoral units, where apparently there is a second schedule in the bill that creates extra constituencies. Again, this is the most unconstitutional part of this particular bill. And I am confident that the courts will throw it out. There is the BBI task force has no power whatsoever in any part of law to create constituencies. They can only propose that IEBC should speed up the review of boundaries and constituencies or set a number, but not to allocate them to various counties and various electoral units. And in any case, the manner in which this has been done is extremely pedestrian. By the time, the reason why IEBC goes to the ground and talks to the locals before it undertakes delimitation of boundaries, it's because you start boundaries review at the polling station level and at the ward level before you get to the constituency level. The unconstitutionality of this particular clause goes on to purport to direct IEBC how to undertake the work that is constitutionally mandated to do under Article 89. And lastly, I'd like to point out, again, as part of the fraud that is being perpetrated by this BBI bill, is when they tell counties that you will get 35%, it will be increased to 35%. Remember, 35% of zero is zero. If you want to increase resources to counties, then you must increase the revenue base. If the revenue base increases, and you end up with a situation where you're even saying 10%, it will still be 10% of a substantial amount. You could get 50% of an insignificant or non-existent amount. Again, this is a very convoluted manner in which you can lie to people that you will increase the amounts that are going to the counties. And with those few remarks, Honorable Speaker, I beg to strongly oppose this charade and this fraud that is being used to con and fool Kenyans. Thank you.